people are constantly complaining about Obama, social media, Twitter, what a loser he is, so stupid, blah, blah, blah. And he can do anything, Sometimes, of course, he seems to put national security agency and start snooping on them. But if you try not to pay tax in the US, you'll get into a lot of trouble. And that's what infrastructure power is. And in the case of pre-modern East Asian polities, of course the emperor had a great deal of despotic power. But usually he had very little infrastructure power, which is why you could be the emperor, living in the Forbidden City in Beijing, and yet have absolutely no control over what language people spoke, what kind of ideas they have, right? How they conducted their religious affairs, because you just don't have the bureaucracy to control all these things. Today, of course, the Communist Party has profound infrastructure power. And that's the difference of modern only. And that's why the modern period is so different from pre-modern period. And as I keep on saying, one of the main institutions that did this was the military. So very often it's almost tempting to call modernity in East Asia military modernity. Right? And it means a lot of different things. So we take for granted, for example, when we have a class at 6:30, you come at 6:30. Well, not today. Most people came at 6:34. But still, you come more or less on time. Right? But this, of course, is completely dependent on clock time. Everyone has access to clock time. But everyone's also disciplined. Come on time. And this is a truly quintessential modern characteristic. You just can't do this. And you'll know this if you go to the countryside. You don't make appointments to have coffee at 3 o'clock at Starbucks. Not only because there are no Starbucks, not only because there are no coffee, because this idea of meeting at 3 o'clock is just fun. You just kind of come and go. Oh, I'll go there. When? Yeah, sometime. But that's the traditional way most people have lived most of the time. But today, we say, we'll meet at Starbucks across the gate at 3:30. And if you don't come, we'll call you. And the state, of course, becomes quite, I should talk about this more, kind of patriarchal. I mean, it's not that pre-modern societies were not patriarchal, although it's more accurate to say they're patrimonial. But new form of patriarchy becomes very powerful. I'll talk about this now. So the punchline is that the Japanese modern that gets exported and applied to other East Asian society becomes one way in which East Asia becomes like the society assumed in Western social theory. And as I kept on saying, it's not just the job titles, the way corporations are named, the legal system, the philosophy books we read, but even things like architecture. You walk around this university, and sometimes, people think, oh, this looks just like Todai, University of Tokyo. This reminds me of, old Seoul National University, so on and on. Well, one of the reasons, of course, is it's the Japanese model. I'm going to talk very quickly. The second source is that this becomes really accentuated after World War II. And in much of East Asia, it's the power of the U.S. Right? It's the power of the U.S. This is true, obviously, in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Not as much in China, mainland China. Not as much, obviously, in North Korea. Which is why North Korea truly should strange people. You read stories about North Korea, and you think this is crazy. Well, one of the reasons it seems so strange, of course, is that they didn't change as much. So one of the easiest way in which we can think about change is that if you went back to 1940s, the stereotype was that people in North Korea were much taller than people in South Korea. I understand that in Taiwan it's different. It's people in the South who are supposed to be taller, but in the case of Korea, it's people in the North who are supposed to be taller. But now we know that on average, South Korean 18-year-old is 15 centimeters taller than North Koreans. 15 centimeters. That's like different races of people. Right? And not only are they taller, they just look completely different. And not to mention the clothes they wear, the kind of habit of everyday life. They become different people. But that's because South Korea changed in the last 50 years. Not so much because North Korea changed. And so that's just one illustration, I think, of the profound change. And you can talk about almost every aspect of life. Not so long ago, even in Taiwan, even in South Korea, there are people who weren't too sure about democracy. Today, it's hard to find people who will openly say, I don't like democracy. It's very hard, and it's very interesting, because the idea of democracy was so foreign until quite recently. And I can talk more and more, but I will stop for now. The main way, and I think the US became popular, actually is slightly different from the way Japan became so powerful. The main way, I think, is that there was this idea of the US model that people in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan tried to emulate. And US model became most important in Japan and South Korea for the obvious reason that US effectively colonized both countries for 7 years in the case of Japan, and in many ways much longer in the case of South Korea. I'll talk more about this later, so I'm going to skip this for now. So the consequence, though, is a number of things you can see very clearly. To the extent we talk about politics, economics, and even culture, increasingly people use the language, the rhetoric of American living. And most importantly, I think, is this acceptance of this ideal of capitalist democracy, which I'll talk more about later. The second element, I think, is in the realm of culture, which is kind of obvious to you. This is obvious by the fact that we have a class taught in English. But English becomes the privileged language. It's the lingua franca in East Asia. It's not very long ago that the lingua franca in East Asia was Chinese characters. I keep on talking about the story. It's kind of embarrassing, but I came to Taipei, I think this was 8 years ago, and you probably don't use it because you're young, but as you know, there are many mosquitoes in Taiwan, and I get bit all the time. It stings. So there's this thing called, I have a horrible pronunciation, which is part of the story. The Baifayo, white flower oil, it's camphor, right? The sting stops. So I go to these traditional medicine stores, not 7-Eleven. So this old man comes out, and I just say, Boyao, Baifayo or something. And he comes and says, what? I have bad pronunciation. So I said, Baifayo, just what? He's like, so finally I said again, Baifayo. And he says, then he breaks into a huge smile. And he goes in the back. And then brings Viagra. Because obviously I was looking very tired. I lost my chi, I guess. Anyway, the reason, of course, is that English becomes his language. And of course, eventually I wrote the Chinese characters, and of course he understood. But that was the way people communicated, even within mainland China. As I mentioned, people had different dialects, right? So you just went around with brush and paper and tried to look for an educated person and communicate by writing. But this was true everywhere. Not just in China, but in Japan and South and the Korean Peninsula. It doesn't work anymore. Why? Well, Chinese character has fractured. If you go to mainland, you have to look for a very educated person to be able to read Taiwanese books, because you're still using traditional Chinese characters. As you know, in mainland, people use simplified characters. And if you write in complex characters, you have no idea what you're doing. It's really striking. It's not as bad in Japan, but if you go to Korea, north or south, they don't really teach Chinese characters. So what happens, of course, is that English becomes, for lack of anything else, the lingua franca. And it's true in academic life, it's true in business, it's true in politics. When all the heads of state meet, they talk in English or use English translators. Even religions have become less and less important. Until recently, I think Buddhism was kind of a common currency, common religion. So you could always find people who knew something about it. And although it's not completely gone, increasingly, the religion that unites East Asia is increasingly Christianity, Christian denominations. And most importantly, this is most important in terms of kind of phenomenology, like the way we look at people. You look at photos from 70 years ago, and you look at photos of today. What's really different? Well, one of the things that's really different is the way people dress. Even in Japan, which was the most Western, it's only in the 1950s that people really began to give up Japanese clothing, wafuku or kimono, and started to wear just like this. But today, in the 21st century, there's nowhere you can go where this is not the dominant way and clothes themselves. Shirt, pants, shoes, everywhere. And this is a fundamental transformation in the way East Asians dress. And it's, in many ways, very dysfunctional, because the uniform for many people in many places became the Western suit. And if you go to Europe, you realize that even in the summer, it's actually very cool. If you go to Germany, northern Germany, or Scotland, it's very cold, actually, in the summer. Very cold. So it's good to wear a suit, wool suit. East Asia, it's very hot, everywhere. Some hotter than others. It makes no sense, but that's the way we dress. And we do everything from food to drinking. Okay, and the final, of course, is, and this I'll talk about more later, is that very recently there's kind of this intra-East Asian integration in terms of economics, culture, and so on. I'll talk more about this later. So, but the punchline is that so there are these commonalities that make not only ideas readily understandable, but the society itself looks kind of the same. The way you dress isn't all that different from the way people dress in California. But this is not a statement I could have made 50 years ago. Even the way you learn, right? You even get the same professor. So there isn't that much difference. And some people call it globalization. And one of the major forces that's driving it is economic integration, which I think I'll talk more about later, so I will skip this as well. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that there has been this rapid transformation in the last 100, 150 years that's actually accelerated. That makes everywhere in East Asia look more like the kind of society that Western social theorists are talking about, and increasingly not all that different from US or Europe. And so it's not surprising to me that the theories have more relevance. It seems kind of true. Why? Well, you look at Taiwan. Taiwan's democratic. I mean, nominally it was democratic under Chiang Kai-shek. Nominally, but really wasn't. So it didn't make much sense. A lot of people didn't really believe in democracy. I mean, he certainly didn't. He was kind of a fascist, right? I mean, he was a democratic centralist. He was a Leninist of the right. But today, you know, your prime minister will go down saying he's very democratic. I mean, he'll never be caught saying he's against democracy. Just no way. I mean, you know, Park Geun-hye, I mean, her father in South Korea, right? Her father was a dictator. Well, she thinks he was a Democrat. And that she's democratic too. And anyway, my only point here is that even 30, 40 years ago, if you're reading Western social science books in East Asia, people said, I'm not really sure about this. Right? But today, it makes a lot of sense, because it's kind of the same. There's the hegemony of democracy, hegemony of capitalism, the way things are organized, and so on. So I guess, as I keep on saying, the only discourse you find in East Asia everywhere is this nationalist discourse. But as I keep on saying, it's in fact a Western construct. Nationalism is a Western idea. It's just that it's used by people kind of randomly, very often for conservative or reactionary purposes. And one of the reasons this is the case is, I keep on saying, the shortcoming of the social sciences. People by and large in East Asia continue to apply Western social sciences instantly to East Asian reality, but never come up with ideas, so to speak, that would make it somewhat more challenging. Okay, why don't we take a 7-minute break, come back at 8, and you can ask me questions. And if you don't ask me questions, I'll ask you questions.